Avoidants don't fall in love easily or quickly. Before allowing themselves to develop genuine feelings, they put potential partners through an elaborate series of tests designed to determine whether this person is safe enough to risk vulnerability with. These tests aren't conscious manipulation or deliberate cruelty. They emerge from the avoidance nervous system as automatic protective mechanisms built from years of defending against intimacy and emotional exposure. Understanding these tests reveals how avoidants evaluate whether someone can be trusted with their carefully guarded hearts, what they're actually assessing beneath the surface behaviors, and why passing these tests doesn't guarantee a secure relationship, but rather indicates the avoidant has found someone who triggers less fear than others have. The testing process itself reveals the depth of their wounds and the elaborate defenses they've constructed to avoid experiencing attachment-related pain. Test 1. The Withdrawal and Response Assessment. The first and most fundamental test avoidants deploy involves strategic withdrawal designed to evaluate how a potential partner responds to distance and unavailability. Early in connection, when feelings might be developing but haven't yet solidified, the avoidant will suddenly become less available, less responsive, or emotionally cooler without explanation. They might take longer to reply to messages, cancel plans last minute, or create sudden distance after moments of closeness. This withdrawal serves multiple assessment functions simultaneously. Their nervous system is primarily testing whether this person will chase desperately, respect boundaries calmly, or disappear entirely. Each response provides crucial information about the person's attachment style, their level of neediness, and their capacity for independent functioning. The avoidant is unconsciously asking, if I pull away, will this person become anxious and pursue me intensely? Will they respect my space without making demands? Or will they simply move on, proving I don't actually matter? The response they're hoping for exists in a narrow window between two extremes. They need someone who notices the withdrawal and maintains interest without becoming desperate or demanding. Too much pursuit triggers their fear of being consumed. It confirms their worry that connection means losing autonomy to someone else's emotional needs. But complete indifference triggers their abandonment wounds. It suggests they don't actually matter enough to be worth pursuing at all. This testing behavior often intensifies after particularly vulnerable or intimate moments. The avoidant might share something personal, experience physical intimacy, or have a deeply connecting conversation, then immediately create distance to see how their person handles the push-pull dynamic. They're assessing whether their person can tolerate inconsistency without becoming unstable, whether they'll punish the vulnerability by leaving, or whether they'll use the vulnerability as leverage to demand more closeness. What the avoidant is really testing beneath the surface behavior is their own fear of engulfment versus abandonment. They're trying to determine whether this person will allow them to control the pace and depth of connection, whether they can safely be vulnerable without losing their autonomy, and whether this person will stay even when the avoidant's defensive patterns activate. They're looking for someone secure enough to not take the withdrawal personally, but interested enough to remain present. The cruel irony of this test is that the response most likely to make an avoidant feel safe, calm, non-reactive consistency that neither chases desperately nor withdraws completely, is also the response that requires significant emotional maturity and security from their partner. They're unconsciously selecting for people who can handle their defensive patterns without becoming destabilized, which means they're selecting for either secure attachment or for people who have learned to suppress their own needs. During this testing phase, the avoidant monitors their person's response with intense attention while pretending not to care about the outcome. They notice every text, every tone shift, every behavioral change their person displays in response to the withdrawal. This hypervigilance contradicts their stated disinterest and reveals how much the test results actually matter to them. They claim not to care whether their person stays or goes, but their nervous system is completely focused on gathering data about how this person handles distance. Their person might experience this test as confusing mixed signals: hot then cold, close then distant, interested then unavailable. Without understanding the testing function, these mixed signals can feel like rejection or manipulation. But from the avoidance perspective, they're conducting essential reconnaissance to determine whether this person is safe enough to allow closer. The withdrawal isn't meant to hurt. It's meant to reveal truth about how their person responds under conditions that simulate what relationship with an avoidant will actually involve. Test 2. The emotional availability check. The second major test involves the avoidant deliberately remaining emotionally distant or unavailable while observing whether their potential partner demands emotional intimacy or accepts the limitation without resentment. They might avoid deep conversations, deflect personal questions, keep interactions superficial, or maintain emotional guardedness even while increasing time spent together or physical intimacy. This creates a disconnect between behavioral closeness and emotional distance that serves as a crucial assessment tool. The avoidant is testing whether this person will pressure them for emotional openness they're not ready to provide, whether they'll accept the avoidant's pace of emotional revelation, or whether they'll become frustrated and leave. They're trying to determine if this person's love is conditional on emotional access or whether they can be accepted even while maintaining significant emotional walls. This test reveals the avoidant's core fear that people only want them for what they can provide emotionally, and that maintaining boundaries will inevitably lead to rejection. Their nervous system needs to know whether this person will respect their emotional pacing, or whether connection with them will require constant emotional labor that feels exhausting and threatening. They're assessing whether they can be in relationship without having to be emotionally vulnerable beyond their comfort level, whether this person will love the version of themselves they can safely offer rather than demanding access to parts they're not ready to share. What makes this test particularly challenging is that the avoidant often increases other forms of intimacy while maintaining emotional distance. They might spend significant time together, engage in physical intimacy, integrate their person into their practical life, or demonstrate care through actions, all while remaining emotionally guarded. This creates confusion for their partner, who experiences closeness in some domains but profound distance in others. The avoidant watches carefully to see whether their person interprets these actions as evidence of connection despite emotional unavailability, or whether they demand verbal and emotional expressions of feeling that match the behavioral intimacy. They're testing whether they can show love through actions alone, or whether this person will require the emotional vulnerability that terrifies them. They need someone who can translate their practical demonstrations of care into emotional significance without requiring explicit emotional expression. This test also reveals whether their person has their own secure sense of self-worth or whether they need constant emotional reassurance and validation. The avoidant cannot provide that reassurance without triggering their own defensive systems, so they need someone who can maintain their emotional equilibrium without frequent verbal affirmation of the avoidant's feelings. They're selecting for people who don't need what they cannot give. During this testing phase, the avoidant might actually be developing deep feelings internally while maintaining external emotional distance. They might care profoundly while appearing indifferent, think about their person constantly while seeming distracted, and feel significant attachment while displaying none of it. This internal-external disconnect creates the testing condition. Can their person sense or intuit the hidden feelings without the avoidant having to risk expressing them directly? Their person experiences this test as emotional starvation in the midst of other forms of connection. They might feel confused about where they stand, uncertain whether the avoidant cares, and frustrated by the contradiction between the avoidant's actions and their emotional unavailability. The avoidant is essentially asking whether their person can love them without receiving traditional emotional reciprocity, whether they can feel secure in connection that lacks conventional emotional expression. The response the avoidant hopes for involves patience without pressure, acceptance without resignation, and the ability to recognize care even when it's expressed non-verbally. They need someone who won't make emotional availability a condition of continued connection, but also won't simply accept emotional deprivation as permanent. They're looking for someone secure enough to wait while also maintaining their own boundaries about what they need long-term. Test 3. The Autonomy and Independence Evaluation. The third critical test centers on evaluating whether a potential partner has their own robust life, interests, and identity separate from the relationship, or whether they'll become emotionally dependent in ways that trigger the avoidance engulfment fears. The avoidant observes how their person manages time apart, whether they maintain friendships and activities independently, and whether they seem complete as individuals, or whether they appear to need the relationship to feel whole. This test often manifests through the avoidant maintaining significant portions of their life completely separate from their potential partner, while watching to see whether their person accepts this compartmentalization or feels excluded and demands more integration. They might not introduce their person to friends or family for extended periods, keep their schedule mysterious, maintain hobbies and interests they don't share, or preserve time alone that they defend fiercely against any encroachment. The avoidance nervous system is testing whether this person will respect their need for separateness, or whether they'll interpret boundaries around autonomy as rejection and respond with demands for more togetherness. They're assessing whether their person has enough going on in their own life that they won't try to make the avoidant their entire world, which would feel suffocating and trigger intense urges to escape. What the avoidant is really evaluating is whether this person's identity and well-being depend on the relationship, or whether they maintain independent functioning that doesn't require constant connection or integration. They need to know whether they can disappear into their own life periodically without their person falling apart, becoming resentful, or interpreting normal independence as abandonment. They're selecting for someone who won't make them feel responsible for their emotional state. This test also involves observing whether their person pursues them when they're unavailable, or whether they redirect their energy into their own activities without apparent distress. The avoidant watches for signs of anxiety, neediness, or emotional dependence that would indicate this person will eventually demand more closeness than the avoidant can comfortably provide. They're trying to prevent getting involved with someone whose needs will exceed their capacity. The cruel aspect of this test is that it requires their partner to demonstrate a level of independence that might actually indicate secure attachment or might indicate their own avoidant tendencies. The avoidant can't always distinguish between someone who is genuinely secure and comfortable with independence versus someone who is also avoiding intimacy. They might select partners who mirror their own avoidance, creating relationships where both people maintain such fierce independence that genuine intimacy never develops. During this testing phase, the avoidant might deliberately increase their independence and separateness beyond their actual preference to see how their person responds. They're creating an extreme version of what life with them will involve to determine whether their person can handle it. If their person accepts excessive independence without complaint, the avoidant often interprets this as safety, not recognizing that they might be selecting for someone equally incapable of intimacy. Their person experiences this test as being kept at arm's length from significant portions of the avoidant's life. They might feel like they're dating someone who maintains them in a separate compartment, who doesn't integrate them into their wider world, and who seems to value their independence more than the relationship. The avoidant is asking whether their person can accept this level of separateness without feeling rejected or demanding more access. The response the avoidant needs involves someone who genuinely has their own fulfilling life rather than someone performing independence while secretly resenting it. They're looking for someone whose contentment doesn't depend on constant connection, whose identity remains stable without daily reassurance of the relationship's importance, and whose emotional well-being doesn't rise and fall based on the avoidant's availability. They need someone who chooses connection rather than needs it desperately. Test 4. The Imperfection and Authenticity Challenge. The fourth significant test involves the avoidant revealing their flaws, limitations, or less attractive aspects of their personality while carefully monitoring whether their person's interest diminishes, their judgment appears, or their acceptance remains consistent. This test often happens gradually and unconsciously, as the avoidant allows their defended persona to slip slightly, showing moments of weakness, vulnerability, imperfection, or behavior they're ashamed of. The avoidant might reveal struggles they're facing, admit to past mistakes or failures, display bad moods or difficult emotions, or behave in ways that contradict their carefully curated image. They're watching intensely to see whether their person's attraction and interest remain stable when confronted with their authentic, imperfect self, or whether they only wanted the idealized version the avoidant initially presented. Their nervous system is testing their core fear of being unlovable at their authentic core. They're assessing whether this person can see their flaws and failures and remain present, or whether love is conditional on maintaining an impressive exterior that exhausts them to sustain. This test emerges from their deep-seated belief that if someone truly knew them, saw their weaknesses, understood their limitations, witnessed their worst moments, they would inevitably leave. What makes this test particularly painful is that the avoidant is hoping to be proven wrong about their fundamental unworthiness while simultaneously expecting to be proven right. They want to discover someone who can accept their whole self, but they've learned to expect rejection when they drop their defenses, so they test in small increments, revealing slightly more authentic versions of themselves while monitoring for any signs of diminished interest or growing judgment. The avoidant might manufacture situations where they appear less capable, reveal areas where they struggle, or admit to thoughts and feelings they're ashamed of, all while watching for their person's reaction. They're asking whether this person loves the real them or just the image they've projected, whether acceptance is conditional on perfection, or whether it can encompass their full humanity, including their shadows and struggles. This test also involves observing whether their person tries to fix them, rescue them, or improve them when flaws are revealed, or whether they can accept the avoidant's imperfections without making them a project. The avoidant's defensive system interprets attempts to help or fix as evidence that they're broken and unacceptable as they are, which confirms their worst fears about themselves. They need someone who can witness their struggles without trying to solve them. During this testing phase, the avoidant experiences intense vulnerability that they're working hard to mask. They might reveal something significant while acting like it doesn't matter, share something painful while maintaining emotional distance from it, or display difficult emotions while minimizing their intensity. They're simultaneously testing and protecting themselves, hoping for acceptance while preparing for rejection. Their person might not even recognize that testing is occurring because the avoidance revelations often come wrapped in casualness or defensiveness that obscures their significance. The avoidant might share something vulnerable, then immediately deflect or change the subject, making it easy to miss how much courage that revelation required and how carefully they're monitoring the response. They're testing while trying not to be caught testing. The response the avoidant needs involves accepting whatever is revealed without judgment, without trying to fix or change them, and without diminished interest or attraction. They need their person to communicate through words and continued presence that imperfection doesn't equal unworthiness, that struggle doesn't mean they're broken, and that the authentic version of them is more valuable than the defended persona they usually present. What the avoidant is ultimately testing is whether they can be human, messy, imperfect, limited, and sometimes struggling, and still be wanted and valued. They're assessing whether this person's love is conditional on their performing strength, capability, and emotional management, or whether it can encompass vulnerability, weakness, and authentic need. They're trying to determine if it's safe to stop performing and start being real. Test 5. The commitment and future talk response. The fifth crucial test involves how potential partners respond when the avoidant discusses or avoids discussing future plans, commitment, or the relationship's trajectory. This test often appears as the avoidant either completely avoiding any future-oriented conversation or alternatively bringing up future topics to gauge their person's reaction and level of expectation around commitment. Either approach serves the same assessment function, determining whether this person will pressure them into commitment before they're ready or whether they can tolerate ambiguity about where the relationship is heading. The avoidant watches carefully to see whether their person becomes anxious about defining the relationship, pushes for labels and commitment, or seems comfortable with organic development without forcing timelines. They're testing whether this person needs certainty and security in the form of explicit commitment, or whether they can tolerate the ambiguity that allows the avoidant to feel safe, exploring deeper connection without feeling trapped. Their nervous system is fundamentally testing their fear of losing autonomy through commitment. They need to know whether moving forward in relationship will require surrendering their freedom and independence, whether this person views commitment as ownership or control, or whether connection can deepen without the constraints they associate with formal commitment. This test also reveals whether their person has their own life trajectory and goals that aren't conditional on the relationship. The avoidant cannot handle being someone else's entire life plan because it feels like tremendous pressure. They need someone who has their own direction and sees the relationship as complementing rather than defining their future path. Their person experiences this test as frustrating ambiguity about where they stand and where the relationship is heading. The avoidant is essentially asking whether their person can build a relationship in the present without guarantees about the future. The deeper purpose behind the tests. Understanding these tests reveals that avoidants aren't simply being difficult or manipulative. They're conducting essential risk assessment before allowing themselves to experience the vulnerability of genuine love. Each test evaluates a different dimension of safety. Can I withdraw without losing this person? Can I maintain emotional boundaries without rejection? Can I preserve autonomy without abandonment? Can I be imperfect without being discarded? Can I avoid premature commitment without pressure that triggers my flight response? The tragic reality is that these tests often select for partners who either have exceptionally secure attachment themselves or who have learned to suppress their own needs to accommodate the avoidance limitations. Both outcomes create relationship challenges. Secure partners might eventually tire of the constant testing, while partners who suppress needs might later experience resentment or realize they've sacrificed too much for someone who can't reciprocate. Passing these tests doesn't guarantee a secure, fulfilling relationship. It simply means the avoidant has determined this person triggers less fear than others have. The fundamental issue isn't whether someone can pass the tests, but whether the avoidant can eventually develop the capacity for genuine intimacy that doesn't require constant testing and defensive positioning. Without that development, passing tests simply qualifies someone to enter a relationship where they'll face ongoing push-pull dynamics, emotional unavailability, and the exhausting work of loving someone who fears being loved. For those recognizing they're being tested by an avoidant, the critical question isn't how to pass the tests, but whether they want to be in a relationship that requires passing tests at all. These assessment behaviors reveal deep wounds that require professional help to heal, not just the right partner who can tolerate them. Understanding the tests provides clarity about what's happening, but that clarity should inform decisions about whether to continue investing in connection with someone whose capacity for intimacy remains limited by unhealed attachment trauma. The cost of constant testing. What often goes unexamined in discussions about avoidant testing is the profound cost these assessment behaviors exact from both parties involved. For the person being tested, the experience creates chronic uncertainty and anxiety that erodes their own sense of security and self-worth over time. They find themselves constantly wondering whether they're responding correctly, whether they're too much or not enough, whether they're passing or failing invisible assessments they didn't sign up for. This constant evaluation creates a power imbalance where the avoidant holds all the cards while their partner performs emotional gymnastics, attempting to be whatever the avoidant needs them to be. The person being tested often loses touch with their own authentic needs, instead calibrating behavior based on what keeps the avoidant engaged. This prevents genuine intimacy because neither person is being fully authentic. The avoidant is testing rather than connecting, and their partner is performing rather than being. The testing dynamic also prevents the avoidant from experiencing genuine acceptance and love. When someone passes tests by suppressing natural responses to accommodate the avoidance triggers, the avoidant never discovers whether they could be loved authentically. They've simply found someone willing to contort themselves to fit defensive requirements, creating a hollow victory where they've secured someone who can tolerate their patterns but haven't actually been seen or accepted in their full humanity. Understanding the full cost of these testing patterns reframes the question from, how do I pass these tests? To, is this testing dynamic acceptable to me? These questions don't have universal answers, but they're more honest and ultimately more useful than focusing solely on navigating the tests successfully.